People generally mistake Iqbal and Nietzsche as rivals because one claims the love of God and the other claims the death of God. But once you read Iqbal and Nietzsche, it comes out as one of the greatest collaborations of thought and understanding in the history of philosophy. Both Iqbal and Nietzsche, they begin from a similar diagnosis, which is that the modern humanity, it has lost its spiritual center. The traditional morality, the traditional moral system, it has lost its command on the human consciousness, and human beings, they are drifting towards passivity, towards meaninglessness, and towards spiritual decline. Nietzsche, he explains this decline of traditional morality through the rise of scientific rationalism and technological advancement. And he calls this as the death of God, which is basically the death of traditional moral system. And Iqbal, he explains this decline of traditional morality through Iblis's fire, or what he calls as Iblis ka soze daru, which includes lust, greed, comfort, passivity, and non-resistance. Now, both of these thinkers, they call for the renewal, for the rebirth of human creativity. Where Nietzsche gives Übermensch as the solution, Iqbal calls for the strengthening of Khudi or Insaan-e-Kamil. These thinkers may have interpreted the crisis differently, but at the end they meet at the common point of human renewal or the rebirth of the human creativity. On one hand, Nietzsche provokes us to move from the death of traditional morality to Übermensch. On the other hand, Iqbal provokes us to move from the death of traditional morality to Insaan-e-Kamil. And there are different stages that are involved in this process to reach Übermensch or the Insaan-e-Kamil. So first of all, let's know what are the stages that are involved, and then we'll explain and elaborate every stage separately. For Nietzsche, these are the stages involved to reach the Overmensch. First is obviously the death of traditional morality. The religion, the metaphysical beliefs, they lose their authority due to the rise of science, technology, and modernity. Second is the death of God. The highest values, they lose their foundation, they lose their source due to this rise of science and tech. So humanity, it enters a world which has no absolute purpose, no absolute meaning. Third is nihilism. Due to this collapse of traditional morality and old values, it produces a moral vacuum, and there are no new sets of values to fill that void, to fill that vacuum. So people, they experience meaninglessness, moral confusion, and spiritual decay. Fourth is what Nietzsche calls as the last man. Due to this moral confusion, emptiness, and meaninglessness, people, they escape into comfort, into pleasure, and into security. So they become weak, they become conformist, and they become non-resistant. Stage 5 is what Nietzsche calls as the hour of great contempt. This stage is very important because in this stage, the comfort, the pleasure, the desire-driven mind, it starts to feel hollow, it starts to feel empty. So people, they seek growth, expansion, self-overcoming, and creation. Stage 6 is what's called as self-overcoming. The strong individual, he rejects this herd morality and he embraces struggle, suffering, and responsibility. And he starts to create his own values. And then comes the final stage, which is the Overmensch or the Overman. He is the one who transcends this moral vacuum and creates new values. He embodies strength, creativity, and meaning. Now, for Iqbal to reach Insaan-e-Kamil, these are the stages that are involved. First is obviously the death of traditional morality, which happens because of the introduction of imperialism and secularism. Imperialism is the external domination, and secularism is what turns religion irrelevant. Now, when the religion has been turned irrelevant, it results into a moral vacuum because the source of morality, the source of traditional value system, that has been turned irrelevant. Then comes the stage when Iblis, he tries to fill this void, fill this vacuum with his own forces, with his own fire, which involves greed, conformity, and slavery. Then comes the stage when this slavery, this conformity, it starts to feel contagious, hollow, and empty. So that marks the beginning of the awakening of Khudi. Then comes the stage of strengthening of Khudi, which involves conscious love of God and self-discipline. And that eventually turns into Insaan-e-Kamil, or what he calls as the Madhya movement. He is the one who generates meaning through creative, God-conscious selfhood. Now let's unpack these stages. Nietzsche, he begins with the spiritual collapse in Europe after the modern science, after the scientific rationalism, and after the technological advancement. And Iqbal, he begins with the decline of modern humanity after materialism, after conformity and passivity. Now the language, it may be different, but the crisis, it is the same, which is the spiritual, the civilizational, and the existential decline of humanity. Which is that humanity, it has forgotten its potential, it has lost its creative energy, and it has surrendered to conformity and mediocrity and comfort. Nietzsche terms it as the death of God. Now, it doesn't mean that the divine being is literally dead, or it doesn't mean atheism, but it rather means that the old value system, the foundations of old value system, the traditional morality, the traditional moral system, that is what has collapsed. Now, people, they may use the old traditional moral language, but they no longer actually genuinely believe on its metaphysical basis. So that's what it means as God is dead. Now, this old traditional moral system, this old traditional value system, it was the source of collective purpose, faith, meaning, and purpose. And when it collapses, it risks nihilism, which is the belief that the life, it has no inherent purpose, it has no inherent meaning, and it has no higher value. On the other hand, Iqbal, he terms it as the triumph of Iblis, or Iblis ka soze darum, or Iblis's fire. In his famous book Iblis ki Majlis Shura, through the words of Iblis, he begins by saying, मैंने दिखलाया फिरंगी को मलूकियत का ख्वाब, which represents the external domination. Iblis or devil, he is saying that I have installed the desire of domination, the lust for power. But then he realizes that this external domination is not enough, because people, they still have the moral foundations, the morality, the traditional value system, which is the source of resistance, which is the source of faith and collective purpose. People, they can still revolt, they can still resist. Then he says, मैंने तोड़ा मस्जिद दैरो कलीसा का फसून, which means that I have turned the religion irrelevant. So when the source of resistance, when the source of collective purpose, that has been turned irrelevant, now Iblis, he has nothing to fear. And that creates a moral vacuum, because the traditional moral system, it has been turned irrelevant. So both of these thinkers, Nietzsche and Iqbal, they here meet at a common point, which is a moral vacuum. So now Nietzsche, he is at nihilism, and Iqbal, he is at Iblis ka soze darum, or Iblis's fire, which eventually represents the same thing, which is a moral vacuum. Now Nietzsche says that after this nihilism, we are at a crucial crossroad. One leads to passive nihilism and other leads to active nihilism. Passive nihilism is when, after this moral confusion, this moral uncertainty, this emptiness and meaninglessness because of the loss of traditional morality, when after this people, they get drenched into comfort, into pleasure, into this conformity, into mediocrity, and that eventually leads to a spiritual decay. But on the other hand, the active nihilism, it is when this comfort, this pleasure, this desire-driven mind, it starts to feel hollow, it starts to feel empty. This mediocrity, this conformity, this herd mentality, it disgusts you. And this is what Nietzsche calls as the hour of great contempt. And this is a very crucial step, because this marks the beginning of what he calls as the self-overcoming. On the other hand, Iqbal, he also is at a crossroad. He also says that this fire, it can lead you to two different places. One is an uncontrolled fire, when you cannot control the fire. So an uncontrolled fire, it burns everything, it destroys everything. So this uncontrolled fire, it represents fatalism, which is a distorted form of faith, which says that everything that happens to you, it's written in your destiny. It represents spiritual laziness, it represents political passivity, and it represents blind obedience. On the other hand, the fire which is in control, or what he calls as the fire of Khudi, or what he calls as the creative fire. The fire, when controlled, it doesn't burn you, but it gives you warmth, it cooks food for you. So it represents struggle, it represents courage, it represents moral strength, it represents closeness to God, and it represents creativity. And now the continual of this self-overcoming and the continual of this strengthening of Khudi, that is what leads you to Übermensch and Insaan-e-Kamil. Übermensch is the one who overcomes and transcends this herd morality and creates his own new values. He lives courageously, he embraces struggle, and he turns his suffering into his strength. So he represents the self-mastery, and he represents the continual of that self-overcoming. On the other hand, Insaan-e-Kamil is the spiritually perfected person. He is the one who has inner strength and who reflects the divine attributes of strength, of love, of compassion, of humility, of sacrifice, and of strength. He combines his action with spirituality and transforms the society with his moral strength. So Nietzsche, through his Übermensch, calls for the strengthening of mind, and Iqbal, through his Insaan-e-Kamil, calls for the purity of soul through the love of God. One strengthens your mind and other purifies your soul. So in a way, they are the two different pieces of the same puzzle. They are not meant to contradict each other, but they are meant to complete each other. Because the unification of mind and the soul, the unification of the strengthening of mind and the purification of soul, that is what creates a perfect human. If you want more informational and philosophical videos like this, then please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so very much. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.